Hi, I'm Pastor Josiah Black at Peru First Baptist Church, and this is our ongoing weekly Bible study. And this week we are talking about the book of Colossians. We're continuing our study in Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 through 14. So let's get into it. Here's how that text reads in the NIV. For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So there's a lot going on here, and this is really just Paul continuing his greeting and talking about how they've been supporting this particular church ministry in Colossae with prayer and some of the specific ways that he's been praying for them. So let's talk about that a little bit more. For this reason, and this is building off of what he talked about last time, really affirming this church, this movement, for what he was seeing in them so far. He said previously in verse 6 that the gospel was bearing fruit and growing throughout the world, and he's seen that reflected in what's going on in Colossae particularly. So we get the sense that this is a church that's kind of doing it right. There's growth, and there's growth for the right reasons. Their hearts seem to be in the right place. And moreover, their practice is in the right place. So he's sort of affirming those things. So he goes on to this statement, for this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and the understanding that the Spirit gives. Now, this is an important aspect because we, especially in our modern, and I think I've said this before, in our modern church context, we struggle to place the Spirit. And Paul was very much aware of the essential nature of the Spirit to everything that the church was doing. He understood that as the presence of God among these believing communities. Jesus had ascended and gone back up, and for Paul, the presence of God that had been sent and remained was the Counselor, the Helper, the Holy Spirit. So since Pentecost, this was the presence of God among the people. And for Paul, who was Jewish originally, the Spirit dwelling among and in the people would have been very reminiscent of the Spirit dwelling among and within the temple previously in Jewish history, not in Paul's lifetime. But these are similar concepts, things that are resonating for him. And so the Spirit has a very central place in Paul's theology, and the way he talks about the church, and the way he talks about what he wants to see from the church. And it's clear that the Spirit is at the core of everything the church is able to do on behalf of the kingdom. Here specifically, he asks that God fill you with knowledge through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. So there we see a theological statement that understanding and knowledge come from the Spirit. Verse 10, he goes on to say, why? So that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, and growing in the knowledge of God. So this is Paul very simply breaking down what life as a Christian, life as a member of the church should look like. This is bearing fruit in every good work and growing in the knowledge of God. Those are the things that they're to be about. And easier said than done, I think we might think sometimes, but I think we also have a tendency to overcomplicate. And Paul here is reducing this down to a very understandable thing. You should be bearing fruit in every good work. And of course, in other places, he writes about what that fruit looks like, right? We hear about fruit of the Spirit, but he means it here both in that sense and in a more broad sense of there should be good and godly things rising up out of this community in every way that can mean. And so that's something he would want to see in them. And of course, continuing to grow in the knowledge of God. Because Paul would have been very aware, and I think we see this throughout his ministry. Paul never professed complete understanding. He never professed to be done, in the sense of his relationship with God. If anything, he goes on and on about how unworthy and unprepared and, ill-formed he is to be this vessel, to be this person doing this work. So he's encouraging them to continue to grow in their knowledge of God too. and to own that, hey, it's not done. Verse 11, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience. Folks, honestly, a lot of our meaning here, we don't have to go too deep. Like, this is very much just his encouragement and admonishment of this church. He wants them to be strengthened. He's praying that they be strengthened, that they might have great endurance and patience, because he knows this is going to be a long road. Paul often uses athletic or racing sort of metaphors because he views this in a lens that says this is going to be hard work, it's going to last, and it's going to take intentionality. To do those things well, to stay faithful, and to continue to bear fruit, they're going to need endurance and patience. So that's one of the many things he's petitioning the Spirit for on their behalf, that they might be granted those things. I think it's a good word to us too, because I think in our current time and our current context, we're quick to sort of bemoan the culture around us, but we have to remember that for most of the church's history, in a lot of cases, there have been cultural challenges to that. And sometimes even our own power in the culture has been a challenge to us. You know, there were times where the church was sort of on top and was involved in every level of government and administration. And in a lot of ways, that made it harder to be spiritually fruitful. So it's hard to do this work. It's hard to be the church in any season. And so for Paul, you know, here he sees clearly they're going to need that strength. They're going to need that endurance and patience. Finally, he goes on to say that he has been giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. Beautiful little sentence there. A couple things I want to point out to you that are important and that we have to understand about Paul. First of all, this word inheritance is klero, literally inheritance or your inheritance. For Paul, this was a deliberate word choice, because remember, one of the things that Paul's got a lot of goals in his ministry, but in a lot of these different contexts, the work that he's doing is trying to get Jewish folks who are following Jesus and Gentile folks who are following Jesus onto the same page. Because in these early church days, a lot of those Jewish Christians were trying to make claims that said, this is really just for us, or it's for us first and then y'all. And Paul consistently is trying to say, nope. God has qualified all these folks to be inheritance along with his people, his holy people in the kingdom. So he's trying to draw together this idea that everybody who follows after Jesus is going to share in the same inheritance. Any kind of division or distinction that would have been drawn along the lines of Jew-Gentile sort of disappears in the church. Doesn't mean you can't still be culturally Jewish and proud of your Jewish heritage, or culturally Greek and proud of your Greek heritage. That's not the problem. The problem is, on a spiritual level, we need to start moving towards oneness. So that's the idea that Paul's trying to communicate here. And this word inheritance is important because it would have resonated with both people. The Jewish believers would have felt that they were promised inheritance because they had a certain entitlement to the things that God was doing. And that's not entirely off base, because it is the fulfillment of promises that he'd made to them. But the Gentile believers would have also understood what it meant to be inheritance, or to receive inheritance, to be qualified and worthy of that by God. That means essentially you've been brought into the family. This is another reason that sometimes Paul will use adoption kind of language to talk about folks who've come into the church or who Jesus has redeemed, because he's trying to get consistently these two groups to understand how they are to exist together now. So again, it doesn't mean the Jews disappear and the Greeks disappear and suddenly we're all now Christian. It means that on a spiritual level and in terms of our religious practice, but it does not erase those cultures or the things that they found important. You know, they didn't all start to eat the same foods, and they didn't have to recognize the same holidays and all these kind of things that are kind of associated with culture more than the practice of their faith. So an important work that Paul's doing here, and he weaves this in very distinct and subtle ways. But I think it's powerful language. It's an encouragement to us. And verse 13 and 14 is really just good stuff. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So it's talking again about the love of the Father for humanity, the rescue of humanity from the dominion of darkness, and how we're brought into this kingdom that's previously in the verses called the kingdom of light. And of course, here he closes with, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins, talking about the important work that Jesus has done. And actually, as we continue in this chapter, not today, but in the next segment, Paul's going to get into the significance and the importance of Jesus. But I want to call your attention again to how Trinitarian Paul is. And what I mean by that is often when he writes, he will find opportunities to talk about the Father, the Spirit, and the Son, especially when he's doing theological work. So here we see, he's beseeching God through the Spirit, right? We see a reference to the kingdom, and we see that referred to as the Son, the kingdom of the Son that he loves. So we see that Jesus is in this picture too. Paul will very often try to hit all three because he's trying to build this understanding of this incredible three-in-one God that these folks are following. And again, remember, especially for the Greek folks who've come up out of a polytheistic system, he's trying to always work these angles where he's trying to get them to understand God more. It's one of the reasons why Paul's letters are so rich theologically, because he was doing a lot of things at the same time rhetorically. So if it seems sometimes like we're reading a verse and it's really clear to understand, and then I tell you 4 or 5 more things about it, it's because Paul was doing a lot of work very efficiently in these relatively short writings that he would do. And we have had a lot of years since then to mine the depths of what he was trying to do. And of course, we understand that also of what God was trying to do in these contexts. So great stuff here in verses 9 through 14 continues to be primarily about the church in Colossae, but it is blowing up and preparing us for what Paul's about to dive into. And next week, when we start with verse 15, we'll start to get into the meat of what Paul's trying to do in this particular letter. So thanks so much for joining. We'll have another entry in this series next Friday. And as always, I'll have a discussion question or possibly 2 to follow the video. And those will be on the Facebook post. So appreciate you watching. And of course, if you've got any questions or if you ever need any clarity, just leave a comment and I'll get right back to you. All right, have a great day. And I pray that you have a blessed Easter. And I look forward to celebrating with you all soon.